Hi, I'm the Traveling DM, and today I want to talk about skill challenges. Not the kind of skill challenges that are in D&D 4th edition, which is another topic for another video, but rather skill challenges that actually use your skills and how to make them more interesting. So I'm going to start with a dexterity challenge, which is the Milkcrate challenge, which is what we see here. So the way the Milkcrate challenge works, and you can use this for any kind of dexterity challenge, but this is like a fun little pub game that we have for our characters when they're traveling. And my group personally really seems to like it. So the way it works is you take your dexterity bonus. So let's say we have a high dexterity character here. Let's say they have +5. And that's how many rerolls they get. And the way that the Milkcrate challenge works is you roll a d20. And what we do is we start off with 1. So that's to get to the first step, you have to roll a 1 or higher. And once you set that, so let's say here I rolled a 4. So every other step that you move up has to be higher. So the next one has to be higher than a 4. If I rolled a 16, now it's going to be tougher. So now the only thing I can roll is a 17, 18, 19, or 20. Otherwise, I fall. Now, depending on my dexterity, I can have that many rerolls. So what I want to do is when I get to the top, after 6 rolls, I then do the reverse. So every roll has to be less. So if I got to the top and I got a 16, the next one has to be 15 or less as I move down, so forth and so on. And if you win, you bet 1 gold, and we usually have the pot like about 1,000 gold. It could be 10,000 gold, whatever you want. And if you win the pot, if you defeat the challenge, you get the pot. Is how it basically works. Nobody has yet to defeat this Milkcrate challenge yet in my game. But that is one way to make a dexterity kind of skill game inside of your D&D or other RPG game. So the reason why I am bringing this up is because this is kind of a foundation for a lot of other skills. So let's talk about lockpicking. Right? This is another skill check where in rules as written, D&D says you just basically roll 1. You roll 1 roll, and whatever the challenge is, the DC is, if it's DC 13, whatever, and you have dexterity, a dexterity check, and you beat it, you've changed the lock. Instead, I like to think of it more as the mini game within Elder Scrolls when you have to pick the lock. So if you know in Elder Scrolls, there's different tumblers. So an easy lock might only have 3 tumblers. A harder lock might have 5. So we're going to use the same concept here. So the way it works is, let's say our character here again has he has 15 for his dexterity. We take 20 minus 15, and so our first tumbler will be a difficulty of 5. Meaning to get past the first tumbler, you have to roll a d20 that is 5 or higher. And let's say this is a 3 tumbler lock. So the next one has to be higher than the last roll. So let's say I rolled a 10. Great, I got past the first tumbler. My next roll has to be higher than a 10. Let's say my second roll was an 18. All right, well, to get past the next tumbler, the last tumbler, I can only roll a 19 or 20. If I fail, the lock is broken. Now, there's several other caveats here. Just like we did before, your dexterity bonus counts as a reroll. So if you have +3 dexterity bonus, you get 3 rerolls out of this. And this way we're rewarding people that are good with dexterity. Now, let's say I have lockpicking tools. So if you fail a lockpick, the lock is broken, and the only way to get through that is to bust it open. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you have lockpicking, or thieves' tools rather, you can consume those thieves' tools, so they get used and you lose them. And in doing so, you can basically have another chance at opening the lock, because instead of the lock breaking, your tools break. And that's how we kind of end up using tools within our lockpicking mechanic. So if the lock breaks, we then do something similar, which is a strength check. Only this time we use a mechanic that is based on Index Card RPG. So for those who don't know that, it uses an effort system. And so that way the effort system works is you assign an effort. So let's say we assign 10 to this lock, and then you assign a DC. So let's say our DC was 13, strength check. So our characters roll a strength check, and if they succeed, they roll a D4, and that's how much effort, in other words, that's how much progress they've made towards breaking this lock. So if they rolled a 4 and the effort is 10, they have 6 left. And so they roll again, and if they succeed, then they go ahead and roll the effort again. So what is the purpose of all these rolls other than kind of turning it into a mini game? Where is the stakes? The stakes are that we want to also replicate, like in the movies, whenever you're trying to open a lock, you always see the character working the lock, working with his lock picks, and then looking around. And he's looking down the hallway to make sure guards aren't coming, and then he goes back to the lock, and then they look around again. We want to recreate that tension. So the way we do that is we use those cards that we used previously for the dungeon crawl, and we use them here. So every time you roll for lockpicking, at the end of that roll, you take a card. If it's nothing, if the hallway is clear, great, no problems. If there is a dead end, you have to redraw. And if you draw a monster, the guards found you. Now we repeat this with a slight variation for the strength check. If the lock is broken and you have to break the lock, you're now making noise. So it's actually a little bit tougher. So every time you roll, whether you succeed or fail, you bang on the lock. The first time you draw 1 card. The second roll, you draw 2 cards. The third time, you draw 3 cards. In other words, it's getting more and more likely that guards are going to hear you banging on this lock. So there is a cost to trying to force the lock open versus just doing it with the lock picks. So in that way, we kind of have a mini game now for lock picking. We have tension, and we made it much more interesting than just one single roll for a dexterity check or a lock picking check or anything like that. Now, this little thing I got at PAX Unplugged, so I don't really have a link for it, but it's a lock that basically you spin it and you lock it, and I know it's hard to tell, but there's basically a number here, so it's a D20 in here. And so just a little something to add to my game. We use this instead of the D20 now, just to add a little bit more fun to the idea of lock picking. And these aren't in order, so these numbers are a little bit randomized as well. So you spin it, you lock it. What do we get here? A 12, I think, or a 17 on there. So that's a pretty high number. That would be great if that was our third tumbler. Pretty bad if that was our first tumbler, because the next one are going to be harder than the 17. So what we've done here is we've used a thieves tool as a consumable, and so we've made that more interesting and more important for our players. And we've also have a mini game for picking the lock and increasing tension. So what else can we do here? Well, let's talk about having to jump from one platform to another. Now, rules as written, you would just do a dexterity check, and if you pass it, you made it. Let's say I don't have very high dexterity, though. Well, let's say this is very important. Maybe this is over lava, and if you fail, you die. And let's say this is maybe 30 feet in between both of these. So how do we make this more exciting? Well, this is a great time to whip out the rope. If you have a rope as a tool, you can use it as a consumable. In other words, it gets tied to one section and it stays there. So you consume the rope, and it gives you a bonus when anybody who's using it. So once it stays here, any other team members that jump from this location to this location can use this rope. And what it does is it adds a D6 to your check. So you do the same dexterity check, but you can add a D6 to it when you go because you're using the rope. Now let's say the rope was 50 feet, but this was 60 feet. We have 10 feet short. So for every 10 feet, we go down 1 dice. Now, because we're using a D6 for ropes, it can really only go down, it can only extend 10 feet, and instead you'd use a D4. If it was more than 10 feet, at that point, the rope kind of becomes useless. So what do? Well, in my games, you can buy rope at any shop at 50-foot lengths, and you take up 1 slot in your inventory. So if you wanted a 100-foot rope, which is pretty much as much as you would probably ever need. You could buy 2 of them and they take up 2 slots in your inventory. Now you're the rope guy. However, in the dungeons, you can find 100-foot length of rope or chain as treasure. And so that becomes much more valuable because it only takes up 1 inventory slot instead of 2. But once it's consumed, it's gone. So it's something you want to keep replenishing. But in this way, we've kind of, again, brought some sense of needing the rope, making it useful, and making a rope guy kind of useful. It works the same way in a pit, right? You could drop it down, and if there's a DC, you get that extra D6. If you have to climb up, again, I use, for something like climbing, I like to use that index card RPG effort system. So there's a check, and if you pass, you made progress, you roll a D4 to see how much progress you made. So that's another way of using some of our tools. Bedrolls are another one, right? If you have a bedroll, I use that as a tool that you can use anywhere in the dungeon to get a short rest. And it's consumed once you use it. You use it once, it's gone. So, but you can do a short rest inside the dungeon, assuming that it's a safe area. In other words, a cleared room. So that's another nice way to, again, make inventory a little bit more strategic. You know, our players really have to think, what am I buying? What am I bringing with me into this dungeon? What am I going to need? And how's that going to work with my inventory slots? So let's talk about another way to kind of use dice as a mechanic here. So here's a classic trap, right? Here we have our team, and our party rather, and a boulder is rolling down. It's a boulder trap. Now, normally what would happen in Rules as Written is everybody just rolls a dexterity check or an athletics check, whatever they want to roll that makes sense, and if they beat the DC, they made it. That's not very exciting. What we want to replicate is the idea of running down from a boulder, right? So how do we replicate this? So this is another fun little dice game. What we do is we take everybody's dexterity and we take the highest one. So let's say the highest one here was 15. And so I'm just going to turn on the timer here. Okay, so here is a timer, 15 seconds. And what I will do is I'll tell everybody to get ready. And I'm going to start the timer. And within that 15 seconds, everybody has to roll their dice. And what they're looking for is they want to get 3 D20s before the time runs out. And so you'll see them. They'll be rolling pretty furiously here to try and get to that D20. And so what's replicating is the idea of trying to rush down this hallway. There's not a lot of time to think. You're just running. And everybody has a fair chance here. And the dexterity comes in for how much time we have. Now, what happens if you fail? So that's a pretty good question. So if you make all 3 D20s, you make it to the end, or whatever your destination was, safely. No problem. Right? Put these guys in here. Okay. So if you make the D20, no problem. You made it to your destination. You're safe. What if you rolled 1 D20 versus 2 D20s? Okay, so if you roll 2 D20s, you're just going to take damage. So for every slot here, we'll say, so there's 2 sections here. For each one, I do 1d6. So you get 1d6, 2d6. So you take 2d6 damage if you only roll 2 d20s. You got hit by the boulder, but not seriously enough to have any serious injury. If you rolled 1 d20, you get 3d6 damage, 1 extra d6. And if you rolled 0 d20s, you get the 3d6 damage, plus you roll that body dice that we talked about in the previous video to figure out where it hit you. And depending on where it hit you, you lose 1 point to that stat. So if it's the head, it's going to be intelligence. If it's the body, it's going to be constitution. If it's the arm or the leg, it's going to be, the arm is strength and the leg is dexterity. So you got squashed by the boulder. Another way we can use some of these dice to make it more interesting is, let's say we had a trap that was a cave-in. And so when the cave-in occurs, you can either end up on this side or that side. So again, I would do the D20, same idea. And if you got 3 D20s, you don't take any damage, but you decide on which side of the avalanche, of the cave-in, you end up in. Are you going to end up on the side with the rest of your party? You're going to end up being completely isolated from the rest of your party. If you don't make the 3d20, the DM decides which side you end up on. But you don't take any damage, which I think is a fun way to do a cave-in. So in other words, not every trap has to be about damage. Some of the traps just might completely cut you off from the rest of your party or do other things that aren't necessarily about health points or punishing you, but rather just make an interesting decision for you within the game. And what makes that interesting is when our players are going to town, they really have to decide if they want to buy these tools and if they want to put them in their backpack into the dungeon. And that's exactly what we want. We want them to constantly have to decide, do I want to bring these tools with me? Am I going to take 2 slots of rope? That's going to be really helpful. Especially if I'm facing a lava jump, that's going to really save a lot of myself and my teammates. But in doing so, I'm giving up slots for health potions, or an extra shield, or other types of items. So there's this constant balance with inventory. And in order to make that work, we have to have these mechanics in here. And I just think that even though these aren't exactly rules as written, I think they capture a lot of the spirit of what D&D and other RPGs are going for, which is we want to be able to simulate the idea of urgency, but still using skill, and still having punishment if you don't win, but really making it very interactive for the player. In other words, when they have to roll those D20s against the 15 seconds, it's pretty furious. And you'll see that your players really like that. Same thing with the lockpicking. One person lockpicking and then picking a card to see what's happening, you'll see your entire table will be hunched over that person, checking to see if they can pick that lock or breaking that lock and making decisions about it, right? Should we pick the lock? The lock is broken. Should we risk banging on it and opening it, knowing that that increases the chances of us being caught by the guards or monsters that are wandering by? And that's exactly what we want. We want everything within the dungeon to be a positive and a negative decision that our players have to make. It's always risky. The dungeon is trying to kill our players, and that's what we're after. So that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and safe travels.